I inherited more than just a cabin when my grandfather died last autumn. I inherited a question that has haunted me every single day since I first stepped through that weathered door and felt the weight of secrets pressing against the walls. The place stood exactly as he'd described it in his rare letters, perched on the edge of a valley so remote that even the logging companies had abandoned their claims decades ago, leaving nothing but overgrown roads and the whisper of wind through ancient trees. Inside, beneath a layer of dust that sparkled in the afternoon light like scattered stars, I found his belongings arranged with an almost ritualistic precision. His hunting rifle hung above the fireplace, untouched for years by the look of it. His boots sat by the door, still caked with mud from his final walk, and on the desk by the window overlooking those endless ridges of pine and shadow, I found the journals. Leather-bound, water-stained, filled with drawings and observations that made my hands tremble as I turned each page. My grandfather had been a practical man, a veteran and a carpenter, not given to flights of fancy or superstition. Yet here, in his own careful handwriting, were hundreds of entries about something he called the Old Watcher, a presence he claimed lived in the forbidden valleys beyond the ridge, where the maps still showed blank spaces and the trails all seemed to curve away as if by mutual agreement. The entries began simply enough, noting unusual tracks and strange vocalizations during his hunting trips, the kind of observations any woodsman might make. But as the years progressed, the tone shifted into something deeper, more reverent, almost devotional. He wrote about patterns he'd discovered, in the way certain trees were marked, about cairns of stacked stones he'd found in places no human hand should have been able to reach. He sketched massive footprints with measurements that seemed impossible, anatomical details that suggested something that walked upright but was decidedly not human. The drawings were meticulous, done with the same steady hand that had once drafted blueprints for houses and bridges, and scattered throughout were phrases that sent chills crawling up my spine, even in the safety of daylight. "It knows when I'm coming now," he'd written 3 years before his death. "We have an understanding, the Old Watcher and I. I leave what it needs. It keeps the valley safe." Safe from what, he never quite explained, but the intensity of his conviction bled through every word, and I found myself staring out that same window as the sun dropped behind the mountains, wondering what my rational, skeptical grandfather had encountered in those woods that transformed him into a man who kept secrets even from his own family. I had come here to scatter his ashes, as he'd requested, to honor his final wish to return to this place that had consumed so much of his solitary later years. My parents had been relieved when I volunteered, neither of them willing to make the journey to this isolated corner of the world where cell service was a distant memory, and the nearest town was 3 hours of rough road away. They thought I needed the space to grieve, the solitude to process the loss. They had no idea that grief was only the surface of what I was feeling as I sat surrounded by evidence of something that shouldn't exist. The journals mentioned a specific location, a grove marked by 3 ancient cedars, growing in a perfect triangle where he'd asked that his ashes be released. He'd drawn a map on the final pages, a trail that led beyond the boundary of his property and deep into the territory he'd marked with symbols I didn't recognize. At the bottom of that last page, in handwriting that seemed shakier than the rest, he'd written words that I've memorized without meaning to, words that replay in my mind now as I prepare to follow his path into those waiting woods. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're the one who came. That means you're ready, even if you don't know it yet. The Old Watcher will know you. It remembers blood, respect the stones, cross only at dawn, and whatever you do, don't run. Running triggers something ancient in both of you, and you need to meet it as an equal, not as prey. I've left instructions for the offerings in the field guide, hollowed out the center. Trust what your body tells you before your mind catches up. Trust that some mysteries exist, not to be solved, but to be witnessed, protected, carried forward. The world is wilder than they teach you. The world is older than they remember. You'll understand soon. You're my blood. You'll understand. I've read those words 100 times now, and each time the weight of them settles deeper into my bones. Tomorrow at dawn, I'll shoulder my pack, carry the simple urn containing what remains of the man who raised me on camping trips and practical wisdom, and I'll follow that hand-drawn map into a part of the forest that feels like stepping backward through time itself, into a place where the veil between the known and the impossible grows thin enough to tear. I should have left at first light, but the morning found me still at the cabin, paralyzed by equal parts anticipation and dread, reading and rereading my grandfather's final instructions, as if repetition might somehow prepare me for what waited beyond the ridge. The sky had barely begun to pale when I heard the truck, an engine straining up the overgrown access road that I'd assumed no one else even knew existed. I stepped onto the porch as an ancient pickup rounded the last bend, its paint oxidized to a color that might once have been blue but now looked like storm clouds, and behind the wheel sat a man whose age seemed impossible to determine, his face weathered into layers like exposed sediment, his eyes sharp and unsettlingly focused as he killed the engine and climbed out without invitation. He didn't introduce himself, didn't offer pleasantries or explanations for his presence on what was technically private property. Instead, he stood at the base of the porch steps, studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle, as if he were reading something written on my face that I myself couldn't see. Finally, he spoke in a voice like gravel tumbling in a creek bed, rough and oddly rhythmic. "You're the one, then," he said, not quite a question. The one he chose to leave it all to. The cabin, the knowing, the burden of keeping. His words carried an accent I couldn't place, something old and regional, consonants hitting hard where modern speech had softened them. I managed to confirm my relationship to my grandfather, and the man nodded slowly, as if this satisfied some internal calculation. Then his expression shifted into something that might have been concern, or might have been warning, the lines around his eyes deepening into canyons. "Come to scatter him in the grove, I expect," he continued, moving closer now, close enough that I could smell wood smoke and something medicinal on his clothes, something like sage or cedar burning. "Beyond the stones, where the 3 old mothers stand watch." I hadn't mentioned my plans to anyone, hadn't spoken to a soul since arriving, yet here stood this stranger, reciting my intentions as if they'd been announced in a town square. The shock must have shown on my face, because something that might have been amusement flickered in his expression before hardening into deadly seriousness. "The forest talks to those who listen, and your grandfather, he listened better than most, but listening isn't enough anymore. Not with what's been happening since the season turned." He glanced toward the tree line, and I followed his gaze to the wall of evergreens that rose like cathedral columns into the morning mist, beautiful and impassive, keeping their secrets behind bark and shadow. "The boundary stones," he said, turning back to me with sudden urgency. "You've got to respect them, not just pass them by like they're some old hiker's joke. Your grandfather, he understood what they meant, what they marked. Crossing them isn't like crossing any other threshold. It's an announcement, a request for permission to enter a territory that's been claimed since before your people or mine came to this continent." His hand moved in a gesture that seemed both casual and ritualistic, drawing a pattern in the air that my eyes couldn't quite follow. And the forest, it's been restless, unsettled, especially since the last new moon. Things moving that should stay still, sounds carrying where they shouldn't reach. I wanted to dismiss him as eccentric, perhaps touched by too many years of isolation, but something in his demeanor commanded attention, suggested that beneath the cryptic language lay information I desperately needed. I asked him directly what he meant by restless, what he thought was out there that required such elaborate warnings, and for a long moment he simply stared at me with an expression that mixed pity with something like envy. the look of someone watching another person stand on the edge of a transformation they themselves had undergone long ago. "Your grandfather kept the peace," he said finally, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, as if the trees themselves might overhear and take offense. "He made the offerings, walked the paths with respect, acknowledged the old watcher as something deserving of consideration, not conquest. But he's gone now, and the watcher, it knows. It knows when the pattern breaks, when the agreement comes into question." He reached into his jacket and pulled out something wrapped in faded cloth, pressing it into my hands before I could protest. The weight of it was strange, organic, and when I pulled back the fabric, I found myself looking at a collection of objects that seemed pulled from some primitive ritual. Small stones marked with symbols, dried herbs bound with sinew, a carved piece of wood dark with age and handling. "Leave these at the stones before you cross," he instructed, his grip on my wrist suddenly firm, almost painful. "Leave them and wait for a sign that you're permitted to continue. Don't assume. Don't rush. The forest has been here millions of years before you drew breath, and it remembers every disrespect, every violence, every broken promise." He released me and stepped back, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that felt almost physical, and I realized my heart was hammering in my chest, my breath coming shallow despite standing still in the cool morning air. "What is it?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly on the question I'd been avoiding since I first opened my grandfather's journals. "What exactly am I going to find out there?" The old man's face softened then, just slightly, and something like sadness crossed his weathered features as he climbed back into his truck. "That's not for me to tell," he said through the open window, the engine coughing to life beneath the hood. "Your grandfather earned his knowing through patience and presence, not through words handed down like recipes. But I'll say this much, and you remember it when you're standing in the silence and feeling the weight of eyes you can't see. What lives in those valleys isn't what the world believes. It's older than our stories, wiser than our science, and lonely in ways that would break your heart if you truly understood." He put the truck in gear but paused before pulling away, fixing me with one final look that seemed to see straight through to my spine. "The watcher knew your grandfather's scent, knew his footstep, trusted his presence. Now it needs to decide if that trust extends to you, if the bloodline carries the same respect, the same worthiness. It's been watching since you arrived. It'll be watching as you cross. And how you conduct yourself in these next days will determine whether you inherit just a cabin or whether you inherit a relationship with something the rest of the world has forgotten exists." I left 2 hours after the old man's truck disappeared down the mountain, my backpack heavy with my grandfather's ashes, the strange offerings wrapped carefully in my pocket, and a sensation in my chest like standing at the edge of a cliff in darkness, unable to see the drop, but feeling it pulling at my center of gravity nonetheless. The trail began innocuously enough, well-worn and marked, threading through stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock that swayed gently in a breeze, carrying the scent of cedar and damp earth. But within the first mile I noticed the path narrowing, the markers becoming less frequent, as if the forest were slowly closing its fingers around the route, reclaiming what had been temporarily borrowed. I walked steadily, my boots finding rhythm on the packed soil, and tried to focus on the practical aspects of the journey, the distance to cover, the campsite to establish, the simple mechanics of movement through wilderness, anything to avoid dwelling on the weight of expectation that seemed to grow heavier with each step away from the familiar world. My grandfather's journal rested against my spine in the pack's main compartment, and I found myself hyper-aware of its presence, as if the words written there were radiating outward like heat, marking me as someone carrying forbidden knowledge into a realm where knowledge itself might be judged and found either worthy or wanting. The birds sang their territorial declarations and feeding calls, chickadees and varied thrushes creating the normal symphony of Pacific Northwest forest life, and I took comfort in their ordinariness, their cheerful obliviousness to human concerns and cryptic warnings about watchers and boundaries and broken patterns that needed mending. Then, perhaps 3 miles in, just as the trail began its steep ascent toward the ridge, the sound simply stopped, not gradually fading but ending as abruptly as if someone had closed a door on a noisy room, sealing me into silence so complete it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. I froze mid-step, one boot hovering above the ground, my breath suddenly loud in my own head, pulse hammering visibly in my wrists, and for several heartbeats I stood perfectly still, listening with such intensity that I could hear the blood moving through my veins, the minute creak of my pack's straps, the whisper of fabric as my chest expanded with each shallow inhalation. The forest remained. The trees still rose toward the filtered sky. The undergrowth still crowded the trail's edges with sword ferns and salal, but the life had been sucked out of it, leaving only the stage set, the props arranged, but the actors fled to some safer theatre beyond my perception. I forced myself to continue walking, each footfall sounding obscenely loud in the stillness, and the silence followed me like a bubble, moving as I moved, maintaining its boundary around my intrusion into this suddenly hostile space. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Predator nearby, perhaps. A cougar or bear whose presence had sent every creature with sense into hiding. But the explanation felt hollow, insufficient to account for the totality of the absence. The way even the insects had ceased their background hum, the way the wind itself seemed to have withdrawn its touch from the branches overhead. That's when I saw them, perhaps 20 yards ahead, where the trail curved around a massive cedar trunk. The boundary stones my grandfather had sketched obsessively in his journal, rendered in his careful hand from multiple angles, as if he were documenting something of profound archaeological importance. They rose from the forest floor in a deliberate line that crossed the path at a precise diagonal. 12 stones, stacked in 12 separate cairns, each perhaps 3 feet high, their surfaces dark with moisture and furred with moss, so thick and uniform it suggested decades or centuries of patient growth, undisturbed by casual hikers who might have dismissed them as trail markers or the idle construction of bored wanderers. But standing before them, feeling the weight of the silence pressing against my shoulders like invisible hands, I knew with absolute certainty that these stones marked something far more significant than a simple boundary between one patch of forest and another. They radiated intentionality, ancient purpose, and as I approached slowly, reverently, I noticed details that made my breath catch in my throat. Symbols carved into the visible faces beneath the moss, patterns that might have been letters from an unknown alphabet or might have been the natural fracturing of stone, impossible to determine but disturbing in their suggestion of intelligence, of communication across time. I knelt at the nearest cairn, my knees sinking into the damp earth, and pressed my palm against the lowest stone, feeling its cold solidity, its absolute presence, and through that contact came a sensation I cannot adequately describe, as if the stone itself were aware of my touch, as if I'd just announced myself to something vast and patient that had been waiting for exactly this moment, this person, this continuation of a story that began long before I was born. I remained kneeling there for what might have been minutes, or might have been much longer, time becoming elastic in that sphere of silence, and slowly, carefully, I retrieved the cloth bundle the old man had given me, unwrapping the offerings with trembling hands and arranging them on the ground before the stone line, exactly as some instinct I didn't know I possessed instructed me to do. The carved wood went down first, placed gently on moss, then the marked stones arranged in a half-circle, then the bound herbs positioned at the center, and as I completed the arrangement, I whispered words that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, a request for permission, for safe passage, for the extension of my grandfather's covenant to his unworthy inheritor who understood so little but wanted desperately to learn. The silence held, absolute and evaluating, and I remained motionless, barely breathing, while the forest conducted whatever assessment it required. And just when I thought I might scream from the tension, from the impossible pressure of being so completely observed, yet seeing no observer, a single sound pierced the stillness, a long, low call from somewhere in the valleys beyond the ridge, neither animal nor human, but containing elements of both. A vocalization that resonated in my chest cavity and made something ancient in my genetic memory stand up and take notice, whispering that I had just heard something my species was never meant to forget, but somehow had, and that crossing these stones would change everything I thought I understood about the world and my place within its hidden hierarchies. I crossed the boundary stones with legs that felt disconnected from my body, as if I were puppeting myself through movements decided by something older than consciousness, and the silence immediately shifted quality, becoming less oppressive and more watchful, transformative, the difference between a held breath and patient waiting. The trail continued upward through increasingly dense forest, the canopy closing overhead until I walked through perpetual twilight, even though my watch insisted it was barely past noon, and I found myself moving with uncharacteristic caution, placing each boot carefully, avoiding brittle branches, instinctively minimizing my presence as if I'd become prey in an equation I didn't yet understand. The ascent took another 2 hours, my thighs burning with effort, sweat soaking through my shirt. Despite the coolness of the shadowed air, and when I finally crested the ridge and began descending into the valley my grandfather had called the Deep Gorge, I felt the atmosphere thicken further, becoming almost tactile against my exposed skin, carrying scents of loam and decay, and something else, something musky and wild that made the hair on my forearms stand rigid with recognition my conscious mind refused to process. I was perhaps half a mile down the valley trail when I found it, the evidence that transformed abstract dread into concrete terror, a handprint pressed deep into the mud beside a small creek crossing, each finger clearly delineated, the thumb opposable and disturbingly human in structure but scaled up to proportions that defied every category my rational mind desperately tried to impose upon it. I dropped to a crouch beside the print, my pack sliding awkwardly on my shoulders, and extended my own hand above it for comparison, feeling my stomach drop sickeningly as I registered that my palm and fingers covered perhaps a third of the impression, maybe less, the span from thumb to smallest finger, easily twice my own reach, and pressed into the earth with force that suggested immense weight transferred through that single contact. The print was fresh, water still seeping slowly into the depression, filling the deepest portions with murky liquid that reflected the filtered sky above, and around it the mud showed disturbance, a slide mark where something had crouched or knelt, then a series of similar prints leading away from the creek and into the dense undergrowth where sword ferns grew taller than my head, and vine maple created an almost impenetrable tangle. I stood slowly, every nerve ending suddenly electrified with awareness, and scanned the tree line with the intensity of someone who has just realized the mathematics of survival have fundamentally shifted, that I was no longer an observer passing through wilderness, but a participant in an encounter that was already underway, whether I acknowledged it or not. The scent grew, stronger as I stood there, carried on a breeze that shouldn't have existed in that protected valley, an odor simultaneously familiar and utterly alien, containing elements of wet fur and crushed vegetation, and something older, something that smelled the way very old forests smell in their deepest recesses, where sunlight never penetrates and decay happens so slowly it becomes a form of transformation rather than ending. Then I saw what the prince had been approaching before diverging into the undergrowth, and my hand flew to my mouth to stifle the involuntary sound that tried to escape. A deer carcass, perhaps 15 feet from the creek or what remained of one, the body cavity opened with precise efficiency that spoke of intelligence rather than bestial hunger, the choice cuts removed, while the remainder lay arranged almost respectfully, not torn apart in feeding frenzy, but carefully disassembled by something that understood anatomy and possessed the strength to manipulate a full-grown deer like a child's toy. The head remained intact, facing away from me toward the forest depths, and I approached on legs that trembled with each step, drawn by horrified fascination and the disturbing realization that this wasn't random predation, but something closer to butchery, purposeful and controlled. The ground around the carcass showing more prints, a circle of them, as if the creature had moved around its kill with deliberation, perhaps even ceremony. I knelt again, this time beside the deer rather than the prints, and noticed that the blood had been mostly drained, the grass beneath showing wet patches where liquid had been absorbed into earth and scattered around the body in a pattern that couldn't have been accidental. Were branches stripped of bark, bent and placed in arrangements that echoed the boundary stones I'd crossed miles above, markers of some kind, or perhaps a signature, a declaration of presence and territory. The feeling of being watched, which had been ambient and diffuse since crossing the stones, suddenly concentrated into a laser focus that made my spine lock rigid and my peripheral vision sharpen to painful clarity. The certain knowledge that something stood in the tree line directly behind me had perhaps been standing there since I'd discovered the prints, observing my reactions with an intelligence that was evaluating me just as thoroughly as I'd been trying to comprehend the evidence of its existence. I didn't turn, couldn't turn, every instinct screaming that direct eye contact might trigger some response I wasn't prepared to face, and instead I remained kneeling beside the deer carcass, my hands pressed flat against my thighs to stop their shaking, my breathing deliberately slowed to demonstrate non-aggression, submission, whatever posture might communicate to this unseen observer that I meant no challenge, no harm, that I was simply my grandfather's inheritor stumbling through a script I barely understood. The presence held for what felt like hours, compressed into seconds, and then I heard it, a sound so low it was almost below the threshold of hearing, a rumble that I felt in my chest before my ears registered it as vocalization, not threatening, but questioning, almost conversational in its modulation, as if the creature were speaking to itself or to me in a language that predated words but still carried meaning in its tonal variations. And something in that sound pierced through my terror to touch a deeper place, a recognition that made my eyes burn with unexpected tears, though I couldn't have explained why, even if my life had depended on the explanation. I made it back to my makeshift camp as dusk transformed the valley into a cathedral of shadows, my hands still trembling as I built the fire larger than necessary, feeding it branches until the flames leapt high enough to push back the darkness in a generous circle that felt nowhere near adequate against the vast wilderness pressing in from all sides. My grandfather's journal lay in my pack like a ticking device, and I'd been avoiding it since finding the deer carcass, some part of me, understanding that once I read further, I would cross another threshold from which there could be no return, that knowledge would bind me more completely than ignorance ever could. But as full night settled and the fire crackled its solitary conversation with the wind, I retrieved the leather-bound book with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else, flipping past the entries I'd already consumed to reach the pages my grandfather had written in his final years, the handwriting growing shakier but somehow more urgent, as if he'd been racing against time to document truths he could no longer carry alone. The first entry I landed on was dated July 19th, 1993, just 5 years before his death, and the opening line stopped my breath completely. 27 years since our first meeting, and still he returns to the stones when I call, this impossible friend who has kept my secrets as faithfully as I've kept his. And I wonder increasingly who has been studying whom in this strange compact we've forged, beyond the boundary of what men consider possible or sane. The pages that followed detailed not a single dramatic encounter, but a relationship Decades of careful meetings at the boundary stones during new moons. My grandfather bringing offerings that ranged from practical items like salt and dried meat to stranger gifts, books that he'd read. Aloud by lamplight, while the creature he called the Old Watcher listened from the shadows just beyond illumination. Music boxes whose tinkling melodies would draw low vocalizations in response, harmonies that my grandfather transcribed in musical notation across margins, creating duets between human mechanism and something that predated civilization. He wrote about communication through gesture and patience, how over years he'd learned to distinguish different vocalizations, some questioning, others expressing what he could only describe as grief or longing, and how the creature had once brought him a fawn with a broken leg, standing at a distance while my grandfather splinted. The tiny limb, an exchange of trust that had brought tears then just as reading about it brought them now. There were sketches throughout these later entries, attempts to capture the Old Watcher's form in charcoal and ink, the drawings showing a figure that was undeniably bipedal and massive, but rendered with such care and detail that they transcended cryptid stereotype to become almost portraiture, the eyes in particular drawn and redrawn across multiple pages, my grandfather's notes beside them, reading, "How do you capture intelligence that predates language? How do you draw wisdom that makes you feel like the primitive one?" I traced my fingers across one sketch that showed the creature's hand beside my grandfather's for scale, recognizing immediately the proportions I'd seen in the mud print, and underneath he'd written in capitals, "Not animal, not human, something else entirely, something better perhaps." But it was the entry from October 7th, 1997, that shattered my remaining defenses. Written just months before my grandfather's diagnosis, before the cancer that would kill him in spring began its secret work in his cells. "I told him today that I'm dying," my grandfather had written, the words stark and unadorned. Don't ask me how I communicated something so abstract, but after 32 years, we've developed our vocabulary, and he, understood. He made a sound I've never heard before, high and keening, and approached closer than ever previously, close enough that I could have touched him if I dared, close enough to see my reflection in those impossible eyes. He pressed his hand to the earth beside the stones and held my gaze, and somehow I knew he was asking about after. About who would come to the boundary when I no longer could, whether the compact would continue or die with me. I couldn't answer because I didn't know, because I've kept this separate from family, from the grandson I love but have protected from this truth. And my silence made him withdraw back into shadow, and I have never felt more alone or more ashamed. The page bore water stains I realized were tears, my grandfather's or my own I couldn't distinguish, the boundary between his grief and mine, dissolving as completely as the boundary between wilderness and civilization, felt increasingly arbitrary. The final entry I read that night was dated March 2nd, 1998, just weeks before his death. The handwriting I kept reading by firelight, my grandfather's final words blurring through tears, when the fire suddenly dimmed as if something massive had passed between it and the stars, blocking light that should have been unobstructable, and the temperature dropped so precipitously that my breath became visible in clouds that hung in the air, like questions waiting for answers I wasn't prepared to give. The night sounds that had provided ambient comfort, the distant owl calls and insect chorus, ceased completely in a wave of silence that spread outward from my camp like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, and I felt it before I saw anything, that primal recognition that rewires a million years of evolution in a single heartbeat, the absolute certainty that a predator was near, except predator wasn't the right word, because what approached carried intention rather than hunger, purpose rather than instinct. I set the journal down with hands that had forgotten how to function properly, my body locked in that ancient paralysis between fight and flight, while my rational mind insisted this couldn't be happening, even as every animal instinct screamed that it absolutely was. that the boundary between my grandfather's documented past and my present had just dissolved completely. The smell reached me first, not the rot or musk I'd encountered at the deer carcass, but something else entirely. Earth and pine and something older, mineral and alive simultaneously, the scent of deep forest and hidden places where sunlight reaches reluctantly and human footsteps have never fallen. Then I saw the shadow, not cast by my fire, but existing independently of light sources, a darkness that moved, with deliberate care just beyond the circle of illumination, and the size of it defied immediate comprehension because my brain kept trying to reframe it as something familiar, a bear standing upright, a trick of perspective, anything except what it actually was, a figure that stood easily 8 or 9 feet tall, with shoulders that would have struggled to fit through a standard doorway. It circled slowly, staying just out of direct sight, and I could hear breathing, deep and measured, and beneath that, a low vocalization that started and stopped, almost tentative, sounds that my grandfather had tried to transcribe phonetically in his journal, but which no human alphabet could adequately capture, something between a rumble and a melody that I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears. My hand found the journal unconsciously, clutching it like a talisman, and some part of me that had risen from deeper than thought whispered that I was holding the reason this creature had come, that the old watcher knew somehow that his decades-long companion was truly gone, and the journal represented the only remaining thread of connection. The vocalization changed, rising and falling in a pattern that struck something ancient in my nervous system, and impossibly, against every rational impulse, it sounded sorrowful, a grief so profound that species barrier became irrelevant in the face of universal loss. I found my voice, though it came out fractured and small against the vast darkness surrounding my insignificant fire, and I spoke to the shadow using words my mouth formed without conscious decision, telling the presence beyond the light that my grandfather had written about him, about their meetings, and the trust they'd built, about how the final entries had been written by a dying man who regretted leaving their compact unfinished. The shadow stopped moving, becoming so still it seemed to merge with the forest itself, and the silence stretched so long I wondered if I'd imagined everything, if grief and isolation had finally fractured my grip on reality. But then came a response, a vocalization that started low and built to something that wasn't quite language, but carried unmistakable meaning, acknowledgement and question intertwined. I held up the journal, hands shaking so badly the firelight danced across its leather cover in erratic patterns, and said that I was his grandson, that I'd come to scatter his ashes in these mountains he'd loved, that I hadn't known about the old watcher until I'd started reading these pages that documented friendship across a boundary civilization insisted didn't exist. Something in my words or tone must have communicated what language alone couldn't, because the shadow shifted closer just slightly enough that firelight caught the edge of a massive form, and I saw what my grandfather had tried to capture in his sketches, the dense covering that wasn't quite fur, the proportions that suggested human ancestry filtered through completely different evolutionary pressures. Then the creature did something that stopped my heart and restarted it, transformed, stepping just barely into the light's edge so that one massive hand became visible, and with deliberate, unmistakable intention, it pressed palm down against the earth exactly as my grandfather had described in that devastating October entry, holding the gesture while those vocalizations continued, softer now, almost gentle, and I understood with crystalline clarity that transcended language, that this was the same question asked years ago, the same concern about continuity and whether the compact would survive death's interruption. Tears streamed freely down my face as I lowered myself to my knees and pressed my own hand against the cold earth in mirror of that massive gesture, and the sound that came from the darkness was unlike anything previous, an exhalation that carried what I could only interpret as relief, or perhaps recognition that the thread hadn't broken after all. that my grandfather's legacy included this impossible inheritance. The shadow withdrew then, melting back into forest darkness, but the silence it left behind felt different than before, not empty but full of presence, and I sat by my fire until dawn, with my grandfather's journal open across my lap, understanding finally that I hadn't just inherited a cabin, but a responsibility, a relationship that predated my existence and would require me to become someone I'd never imagined being, guardian of a secret that connected me to mysteries older than human memory. I didn't sleep, couldn't sleep, just fed the fire and waited for dawn, while every sound in the returning forest seemed amplified and significant. The crack of branches settling, the rustle of wind through pine needles, all of it now coded with potential meaning after the night's impossible encounter. When the first grey light began filtering through the canopy, I packed my grandfather's ashes in trembling hands and followed an intuition I couldn't name, leaving the trail entirely and pushing through undergrowth toward the valley he'd marked repeatedly in his journal, the place he'd called the meeting ground in entries spanning 30 years. The boundary stones appeared like sentinels emerging from morning mist, larger than the ones I'd passed before, arranged in a circle that had to be intentional, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of weather and covered in markings that might have been natural erosion or might have been something else entirely, symbols that seemed to shift in the uncertain light. I stepped into the center of that ancient circle with my grandfather's remains clutched against my chest, and the meadow beyond opened like a secret being revealed, grass heavy with dew and wildflowers that shouldn't have been blooming this late in the season, everything touched with ethereal beauty that made the ordinary world feel distant and somehow less real. The mist hung thick across the clearing, moving against the wind's direction, and I knew without understanding how I knew that I wasn't alone, that patience was being extended, that something waited for me to complete what I'd come here to do. I scattered the ashes, slowly speaking. Words I'd prepared about my grandfather's love for these mountains, about his devotion to preserving wild places, but the prepared eulogy felt inadequate, so I abandoned it and spoke from raw places, telling the silent meadow about the man who'd taught me to read animal tracks, who'd insisted that respect for nature meant acknowledging mysteries we couldn't explain, who'd apparently lived a double life I'd never suspected, keeping company with something science insisted couldn't exist. The mist swirled as ash mixed with morning air, particles catching light and seeming to glow briefly before settling into grass and earth, returning him to the wilderness that had held his heart more completely than any of us who'd called him family had understood. Movement in the fog made me freeze mid-sentence, not the rustle of small animals, but something massive moving with surprising grace, and the shape that emerged from white opacity stopped my breath entirely, because this was no longer shadow and suggestion, but physical reality in full. Daylight, whatever remained of it, filtered through mist. The old watcher stood at the meadow's edge, fully visible for the first time, and my mind struggled to process details that seemed to contradict each other. The powerful build that suggested immense strength combined with posture that spoke of age and weariness, the features that were neither fully human nor entirely ape, but something that existed in evolutionary space, between or perhaps beyond both. We stood frozen in mutual observation, predator and prey distinctions meaningless in the face of this moment, and what struck me with devastating force wasn't fear, but recognition. The bone-deep certainty that I was seeing, something that had walked these mountains since before roads and cities, a remnant of wilderness that refused to be explained away or diminished by human expansion. The creature moved forward with steps that barely disturbed the grass, approaching the place where ash had settled, and I should have run. Every survival instinct screamed that I should put distance between myself and this impossible being. But my grandfather's words echoed louder, his insistence that the old watcher was guardian, not monster, witness, not threat. It lowered itself down with careful deliberation until it sat cross-legged like a monk in meditation, and one massive hand reached toward the ash-scattered earth with such reverence that my throat constricted painfully, understanding that I was witnessing grief expressed across species boundary, mourning that needed no translation. The vocalizations that came were different from the night before, softer and more complex, rising and falling in patterns that felt like language, even though I couldn't understand words. And impossibly I found myself responding, telling this ancient being that my grandfather had written about their friendship, that his final entries had been filled with regret about leaving promises unfulfilled. Those eyes found mine across the diminishing distance, and what I saw there shattered every assumption I'd carried into these woods. Intelligence that was undeniable, emotion that was unmistakable, and something else I couldn't quite name. A weighing or assessment that made me feel simultaneously exposed and strangely safe. The morning light strengthened around us, burning through mist, and I realized we'd crossed some threshold from which there could be no return. To innocent ignorance that this moment was changing me at fundamental levels I couldn't yet comprehend, rewriting the boundaries of what I believed possible. Then the old watcher did something that stopped time entirely, reaching into the grass and carefully gathering a small handful of ash-touched earth, holding it cupped in massive palms with such tenderness that tears streamed freely down my face. And in that gesture, I understood that my grandfather hadn't just studied or observed this creature, but had formed genuine friendship, that two beings from impossibly different worlds had found common ground in these mountains and maintained connection across decades. The creature lifted the earth to its face, inhaling slowly as if committing scent to permanent memory. And the sound that emerged was simultaneously mournful and accepting, grief acknowledged and released in the same breath. When those ancient eyes found mine again, they held something new, question and invitation intertwined, and with deliberate care, the old watcher stood and gestured toward the deep forest beyond the meadow, toward valleys I couldn't see and places that existed beyond any map, an unmistakable offer to follow, to learn, to step fully into the inheritance my grandfather had left unspoken. My heart hammered against my ribs as I understood the weight of this moment, that saying yes meant accepting a responsibility that would separate me permanently from the ordinary world, while saying no meant severing a connection that had survived my grandfather's death to reach across generations seeking continuation. The morning hung suspended as I stood at that crossroads, the mundane world behind me and the unknowable wilderness ahead, while the old watcher waited with patience that spoke of centuries, offering passage into mysteries that most humans would never glimpse, asking only that I be brave enough to see what my grandfather had seen, to become guardian of secrets older than human memory. I took one step forward, then another, and the old watcher's posture shifted with what I can only describe as relief, as if my grandfather's absence had created a wound that required tending, a broken covenant that needed renewal through me. We moved together across the meadow toward the forest's edge, and with each step I felt the weight of civilization falling away like shed skin. The concerns that had consumed me just days ago, work deadlines and social obligations and the small dramas of ordinary life, all of it rendered meaningless in the presence of something so fundamentally other. The creature paused at a massive cedar that must have been standing when my grandfather was born, placing one hand against bark worn smooth by weather and time, and I understood this was another boundary stone, a marker between the world of human noise and something older that required different rules. When I placed my own palm against that ancient wood, I felt it humming with life that went deeper than roots, a vibration that seemed to connect directly to my chest, and the old watcher made a sound of approval, a rumbling affirmation that I was learning the first lessons of a language without word. We climbed higher into mountains that appeared on no hiking maps, following game trails that twisted through old-growth forest, and I noticed how the creature moved with absolute knowledge of this terrain, touching certain trees in passing as if greeting old friends, avoiding areas that looked no different to my untrained eyes, but clearly held significance that made them forbidden or sacred. After what might have been hours or might have been minutes, time losing meaning in that primordial space, we emerged onto an overlook that stole what remained of my breath, a hidden valley stretching below us, untouched by logging or development, a pocket of wilderness that existed as it had for millennia. The old watcher sat on a boulder that commanded the view, gesturing for me to join, and side by side we looked out over territory that suddenly revealed itself as home to others, dark shapes moving through distant clearings, not one creature but several, a family or community that had somehow survived extinction through isolation and fierce protection of boundaries humans couldn't perceive. My grandfather's words echoed with new meaning, his insistence that the old watcher was guardian, because I understood now what was being guarded, not just individual creatures, but an entire ecosystem of impossibility, a refuge where beings that couldn't exist according to modern science continued existing anyway. The creature reached into a crevice in the rock and withdrew something that made my heart lurch, my grandfather's old watch. The one he'd claimed to lose on a fishing trip 15 years ago, its leather band cracked with age, but the metal still gleaming. The old watcher placed it carefully in my trembling hands, and I realized this was confirmation beyond any doubt, physical proof of connection spanning decades, a deliberate keeping of memory that spoke to depth of relationship I was only beginning to comprehend. Tears blurred my vision as I held that watch against my chest. Understanding that my grandfather had sat in this exact spot, had been given access to secrets that perhaps only a handful of humans in history had witnessed, and had carried that knowledge in silence because speaking it would have invited destruction of everything he'd worked to protect. The old watcher vocalized softly, a sound that carried unmistakable query, and somehow I understood the question being asked, whether I could bear the same burden, whether I possessed strength to become keeper of mysteries that would separate me from my own kind in fundamental ways. I thought of the life waiting back in the city, the apartment and career and friends who would never understand where I'd actually been or what I'd actually seen, the inevitable gap that would open between my inner reality and any explanation I could offer, the loneliness inherent in guardianship of truth that sounded like fiction. But I also thought of my grandfather's face when he'd spoken about these mountains, the light in his eyes that I'd attributed to simple love of nature but now recognized as something deeper, the profound satisfaction of living in alignment with purpose larger than self. I looked into those ancient eyes and saw reflected there the weight of centuries, the exhaustion of hiding, the hope that perhaps another human might prove trustworthy enough to share the burden of witness. And I understood that saying yes wasn't just accepting inheritance, but offering companionship to profound isolation. I spoke words that felt drawn from somewhere older than my own thoughts, promising that I would honor what my grandfather had begun, that I would protect these mountains and the impossible beings who dwelled here, that I would place offerings at boundary stones and keep silence except in journals that would wait for whoever came after me. The old watcher extended one massive hand palm up in gesture that needed no translation, and after only the briefest hesitation, I placed my own hand against that leathery palm, feeling the calluses worn by decades in wilderness, the warmth that proved this was living flesh despite every impossibility, the gentle pressure that sealed agreement between us like contracts signed in blood but witnessed only by ancient trees. Something shifted in the air around us, a settling or recognition, as if the forest itself acknowledged the pact made on that overlooking stone. And distantly I heard vocalizations from the valley below, other voices joining in what might have been approval or welcome, or simply acknowledgement that the guardian position hadn't remained empty after all. When the old watcher released my hand and stood, gesturing that it was time to return to the boundary between worlds, I rose with legs that shook from more than physical exertion, transformed utterly from the person who'd arrived at my grandfather's cabin, carrying nothing but grief and ashes, now departing as custodian of living mystery that would define every remaining day of my existence. The descent from that sacred overlook felt like moving through layers of dream, each step returning me incrementally to the ordinary world, while something fundamental in my consciousness remained forever altered, stretched between two realities that couldn't coexist except through the impossible bridge my body had become. The old watcher guided me down through passages I hadn't noticed during our ascent, natural corridors through stone and root that seemed to shift closed behind us, protecting the valley's location through geography that defied conventional mapping. We walked in companionable silence that needed no filling, the creature occasionally pausing to let me catch my breath or navigate particularly difficult terrain. And in those moments of assistance, I felt the full weight of what guardianship meant, not domination or ownership, but stewardship expressed through patience and attention to those more vulnerable. My grandfather's watch ticked against my chest, where I'd secured it inside my jacket, its rhythm matching my heartbeat, a metronome connecting past and present and future in unbroken chain of responsibility. As we approached the boundary stones that marked the edge of maps and human comprehension, I felt resistance building in my chest, not fear, but reluctance to leave this liminal space where impossibility breathed and walked beside me, where the modern world's insistent rationality couldn't diminish what my senses confirmed as absolutely real. The old watcher seemed to sense my hesitation, making a low sound that carried reassurance, reminding me that boundaries existed to be respected, but not to separate permanently. That guardianship meant return and continuity rather than single encounter. I understood then that this wasn't goodbye, but rather initiation, the first meeting of what could become lifetime relationship if I proved worthy of the trust being extended, if I honored the pact made on ancient stone with consistency my grandfather had demonstrated across decades. At the boundary line itself, where stacked stones wore their moss like ceremonial garments, the creature stopped and turned to face me fully, and I met that gaze. Without the terror that had paralyzed me during our first encounter, seeing now not monster but person, consciousness shaped by different evolution, but no less valid or profound than human awareness. One massive hand reached toward my face, and I held perfectly still as rough fingertips touched my forehead with surprising gentleness, a gesture that felt like blessing or recognition, or perhaps transfer of something intangible that language couldn't capture. The pressure lasted only seconds, but seemed to imprint itself on my skull, a phantom warmth that would remain long after contact ended, marking me in ways invisible to ordinary sight, but perhaps perceptible to others who moved in these mountains, other guardians or creatures who would know from that touch that I carried permission and purpose. When the hand withdrew, I felt tears tracking down my cheeks, not from sadness, but from overwhelming sense of being seen completely, accepted despite human fragility and ignorance, welcomed into community that existed outside every structure my species had built to organize reality. The old watcher vocalized one final time, a complex sound that seemed to contain instruction and encouragement and warning all woven together, and though I couldn't translate specific meaning, I felt its essence settle into my bones like instinct, knowledge that would surface when needed, even if conscious mind couldn't articulate it. Then the creature moved backward into shadow between trees, and I watched that massive form blend with forest until I could no longer distinguish living being from landscape. Dissolution so complete it might have been magic, except I understood it was simply mastery of environment humans had forgotten how to achieve. I stood at those boundary stones until full darkness gathered around me, not wanting to break the spell by moving, not ready to face the return to cabin and eventually city, and the life that waited with all its demands and explanations I couldn't offer. But as stars emerged overhead, visible here in ways they never were through urban light pollution, I felt resolve hardening into something like peace, understanding that carrying mystery didn't mean abandoning human world entirely, but rather living as bridge between realms, feet planted in civilization while heart remained tethered to something older. My grandfather had managed exactly this balance, maintaining relationships and routines while secretly serving purposes no one around him suspected, and his example proved it possible even if profoundly lonely at times. I thought of his journals waiting at the cabin, decades of observations and reflections that would become my textbooks, teaching me not just about the old watcher, but about how to bear knowledge that couldn't be shared, how to find meaning in service that brought no recognition or validation from society at large. When I finally turned to follow my own footprints back through moonlit forest, I walked with different weight in my steps, carrying grandfather's watch and creature's blessing and the first real sense of purpose I'd felt since receiving news of the inheritance that had seemed like burden, but revealed itself as calling. The cabin's lights appeared through trees like beacons marking the edge between worlds, and I paused at that threshold, my hand on the doorframe, understanding viscerally what my grandfather must have felt, returning from each encounter the necessary compartmentalization required to exist in domestic space while holding wilderness inside chest cavity like second heart. I entered slowly, seeing the familiar room transformed by what I now knew existed just beyond its walls, every object suddenly provisional and temporary, compared to ancient valleys and impossible beings who'd survived extinction. Through isolation and human guardians willing to maintain protective silence, my phone sat on the table where I'd left it days ago, multiple missed calls and messages from the world demanding my attention and return, questions about when I'd be back to work, friends wondering why I'd gone silent, the persistent hum of civilization expecting conformity to rhythms that now felt alien as lunar gravity. I picked up that device and felt its wrongness in my hand, this connection to networks and noise that couldn't contain or acknowledge what I'd experienced, and I understood with sudden clarity that I couldn't return to my old life, not completely, that something had broken or awakened, that made previous existence impossible to resume without fundamental changes. I would need to find new patterns, new work that allowed flexibility to return to these mountains regularly, new relationships or solitude that didn't require explanations I couldn't provide, reshaping entire existence around the secret that would define everything. Going forward, just as my grandfather had reshaped his life around responsibility, he'd accepted on some long-ago encounter that paralleled my own. The journal I now keep differs from my grandfather's only in handwriting. The same leather-bound volumes, ordered from the same obscure supplier in Oregon, filled with the same mixture of naturalist, observation, and mystical encounter that would read as fiction to anyone lacking context we shared across death's boundary. 3 years have passed since that first meeting with the old watcher, 3 years of monthly pilgrimages to the boundary stones, regardless of weather or personal circumstance, carrying offerings that vary with seasons but always include tobacco my grandfather favored and salt from the coast he loved, small gestures that maintain connections stronger than any contract written in human language. I've learned the creature's patterns now, the subtle signs that indicate presence, even when visibility remains impossible, the way certain birds fall silent, while others actually increase their calling, alert systems built into ecosystem itself for those patient enough to develop literacy in wilderness languages. My apartment in the city has become merely storage facility for the persona I maintain for tax purposes and social credibility, while this cabin represents true home, walls that contain my actual life. Even during weeks, I'm physically absent, working remote jobs I've carefully selected for their flexibility and minimal human interaction. Friends from my previous existence have mostly fallen away, unable to relate to my increasing reclusiveness and strange scheduling around lunar phases, their invitations growing less frequent until they stopped entirely. And I feel no grief over these losses because something larger has filled the spaces where conventional relationships once provided meaning. The offerings have evolved beyond simple tradition into genuine communication, a vocabulary of objects and placement through which I signal questions or concerns or gratitude. And the old watcher responds through arrangements of stones or specific plants left near the cabin, or occasionally tracks pressed deliberately into earth where I'll find them during morning walks. We've developed relationship impossible to explain to outsiders, partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose that transcends species boundary through sheer commitment to understanding despite vast differences in form and perception. I've witnessed things during these years that confirm my grandfather's writings weren't metaphor or delusion, but careful documentation of reality that persists parallel to human world, largely unnoticed because most people have lost capacity to see what doesn't fit. Predetermined categories of possible. Other creatures move through these mountains, not just the old watcher, but others of its kind, and perhaps different species entirely, glimpsed at periphery during deep forest journeys, or revealed through evidence I've learned to recognize. And I understand now that my grandfather guarded not single being, but entire hidden ecosystem that survived here through cooperation between ancient inhabitants and select human allies willing to prioritize preservation over revelation. The responsibility weighs heavier some days than others, particularly when I encounter hikers or hunters who've strayed too close to protected valleys, and I must perform misdirection or gentle discouragement, becoming the paranoid local I once dismissed, speaking in riddles that protect while warning, maintaining barriers that feel increasingly necessary as human pressure on wilderness intensifies with each passing season. Last month, I met another guardian entirely by accident, elderly woman at the general store whose eyes tracked to my boots, still muddy from morning hike, and something in her expression shifted into recognition that made my pulse quicken with mixture of relief and concern. We said nothing in that public space, but she touched my hand briefly while giving change, pressing piece of paper into my palm with coordinates and single word written in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting that she must have kept for years, waiting for moment she'd need to pass message to his successor. I hiked to that location during the next new moon and found her waiting a different set of boundary stones miles north of my usual territory, and we stood together in darkness, comparing journals and experiences. Two guardians confirming for each other that the calling wasn't madness, but authentic service to something deserving protection. And in that conversation, I felt loneliness I hadn't acknowledged finally ease its grip on my chest. She told me there were others scattered through these mountains, whole network my grandfather had been part of. Individuals who'd each formed bonds with the old watchers in their territories and maintained silence except among ourselves. Secret society with no meetings or hierarchy, but shared understanding that some truths required protection rather than proclamation. Before we parted, she gifted me her oldest journal, pages dating back 40 years, and told me to add it to whatever archive I was building, ensuring continuity of knowledge in case something happened to either of us. And I understood I was being welcomed into lineage, extending back further than either of us could trace. Guardians teaching guardians across generations in unbroken chain of service and witness. Now I sit at my grandfather's desk, my desk, adding tonight's observations to pages that will someday pass to whoever inherits this cabin, and calling after I'm gone, hoping I'll have wisdom to recognize that person when they appear, trusting I'll know how to guide them through terror into acceptance as the old watcher guided me, as my grandfather's journals guided us both across the boundary between life and death. The watch he carried rests beside my hand, still keeping perfect time, still connecting past and present and future in its patient mechanical heartbeat. And through the window, I can see the first stars emerging over ridgeline that marks edge of protected valley, ancient peaks standing guard over secrets that predate human language. Tomorrow, I'll return to the boundary stones with offerings for the new moon, and perhaps the old watcher will emerge from shadow, or perhaps I'll feel only that familiar presence watching from distance. But either way, I'll know the covenant holds, that some bonds transcend individual lifetimes to become something closer to sacred duty, inheritance more valuable than property or money, because it connects us to what we were before civilization taught us to forget, to what we might become again if enough of us remember how to listen to what the wilderness has always been saying to those willing to hear. What would you sacrifice to protect a truth the world isn't ready to know? Subscribe to hear more stories from the edge of what we understand.